G'day guys, E53 here, and this video is going to be about supercars, as you would know from the title. And we see at the moment a couple of weeks out from the start of the 2019 supercars season. And I'm not sure when you I'm actually going to upload this video, so it might be a week or a few days away by the time you actually see it. So just basically doing the recording now. So as things sit, we are a couple of weeks away. And before I really start the video, I'd like to say I'm not anti-supercars. I don't hate supercars. In fact, quite the opposite. I think this philosophy that we've had served us pretty well since 1993, when everyone got tired of the Sierra and the GTR dominating, and they killed off Group A. And there's no doubt it's been extremely popular and very, very successful. But just looking forward at the moment, it doesn't appear as though there's a lot on the horizon. There seem to be a few factors really sort of counting against the category at the moment, and the way in which they deal with that, and the way that external market forces kind of dictate the involvement of manufacturers and so on, is going to really dictate where the series goes from where it's sat at the moment. So to understand a little bit about where it's heading, we'll just cover off a little bit of background about where it all originated, because there may be people watching who don't necessarily know the entire history of how we got to this scenario that we're in at the moment. So as mentioned, supercars got its beginnings in 1993 when the Group A got the boot. People were tired of one car dominating, and the costs had run out of control, and this was the case the world over. So before everyone out there with a neck tat says, oh, they just didn't like the GTR killing Holden, I'll let you know Group A was killed by the FIA. The entire world stopped running at the same time. It was being dominated by homologation specials like the Sierra, like the GTR over here and in Japan, and they just needed a change. And this global formula for touring cars had really run its course. So while Germany went across to their DTM and the British went, they made their 2-litre touring cars and everything, we had our homegrown V8s, which is exactly what the crowds were really calling for in this country. And at first it was great. You know, we had the 5-litre V8 engines in the Commodores and the Falcon chassis, mean-looking body kits. Parochial Aussie crowds loved them, especially the Ford fans who hadn't seen a Falcon in race trim since the early 80s. And the racing was decent too, at least at first. So by the time the second generation cars rolled around, so we're really talking about sort of the EL Falcon and the VRVS Commodores, the teams had them pretty well figured out. The unpredictability had gone. The racing, although people choose not to remember them that way, had really stagnated. The sprint race format, run everywhere bar Sandown and Bathurst, meant whoever started on pole usually won the race. And to make matters worse, there was a new threat to supercars, which was still back then called the Australian Touring Car Championship, on the horizon. And of course that was the 2-litre touring cars, or Super Tourers from Britain, which we mentioned just before. So as us Aussies were getting on with racing our big V8s, the Brits had developed this fantastic formula for their touring car racing, with tons of different manufacturers and racing that made NASCAR look spread out. Lots of panel rubbing and crashes and lots of spectacular stuff going on. The racing was great. And it was so good that an Australian series started running under the same rules as well. And for a while it actually looked as if the days of the V8 were numbered. They even lost the Bathurst 1000, which in those days was not a championship round, to the little Euro cars, and they needed to run their own Bathurst 1000 a few weeks later. So I'm not sure how many people, some of the older guys may remember that, when we actually had 2 Bathurst 1000 races a few weeks apart. One for the on the traditional October date for the 2-litre cars, and then we had the V8s a few weeks later. So the Australian Touring Car Championship needed to reinvent itself, and it started with a rebrand. The Australian Touring Car Championship would now be known as V8 Supercars, and on the face of it this was a simple rebrand, but something they really had to do, and this is something that not a lot of people actually know, because with typical shrewdness, driver and team owner Larry Perkins had actually bought the rights to the Australian Touring Car Championship name. And any time the rule makers did something he didn't like, he just withdrew his permission for the name to be used until they changed it and they put it back to his way. So essentially you had this owner-driver who had the entire governing body by the short and curlies, really. So the late 90s saw the rebrand of V8 Supercars, the introduction of new and exciting race formats. I guess the Adelaide 500 is the prime example of this, first run in 1999. This more or less coincided with the introduction of the new models from both Holden and Ford, the VT Commodore and the AU Falcon. They were both markedly different in appearance from their predecessors, and with their introduction the racing improved and the challenge of the Super Tourers sort of faded out. But there was another problem: parity. And there was no denying it. The VT Commodore was a far more effective racing car than the AU Falcon. So the factory Holden racing team, with legends in the making, Craig Lowndes and Mark Scaife driving, they were just cleaning up, and the poor Ford teams barely got a look in. Mark Larkham, who back then, you may know him from the TV coverage today, but back then he was a driver and a team owner himself. He discovered in testing that the issue was actually down to a build-up of air pressure under the rearmost corners of the bonnet in the AU Falcon. And when he fitted vents in a private test, the problem reportedly disappeared immediately. But he was denied permission to fit these vents to his race car. Instead, the governing body stuck to their old method of shaving millimetres off spoilers and splitters to even the playing field, but nothing really worked, and the poor old AU never got any joy. So for 2003, Project Blueprint was introduced, and this would eradicate all the under-the-skin differences from between the two makes. Chassis pickup points, track, wheelbase, suspension, driving position were all standardised across both brands, and with the introduction of the VY Commodore from Holden, the BA Falcon from Ford, the differences were just plain for all to see. Both makes were now competitive and the popularity absolutely soared. The race formats were different and innovative. The Sandown 500 and the Bathurst 1000 were now championship races, and the likes of Scaife, Ambrose, Lowndes and Murphy were all household names. Sponsorship dollars were rolling in, and this period, in my view, was the high watermark for supercars, certainly so far. In 2007, V8 Supercars had a problem. Holden just released its new generation Commodore, which was the VE, and there's no other way to say it apart from the fact that it really didn't fit the rules that they had laid out under Project Blueprint, which, if you remember, wheelbase was one of those things that was standardised across the cars, and it was in the rules what the wheelbase had to be. And the wheelbase of the road-going car was way too long, and to make it actually work within the rules, the race car had to have a whole section cut out of the middle of it, meaning shortened doors, lower roof line than the road car to make it look right. And unless the cars were parked side by side, you never know. They actually did a really good job of it, of actually concealing it all. So you wouldn't actually know to look at the race car. But the fans did know. And more importantly, this was a moment of huge significance in the future of what would be acceptable moving forward in terms of changing from the road-going spec. So for 2013, V8 Supercars introduced its next generation rules package, or Car of the Future, which was following very closely NASCAR's Car of Tomorrow, which was around about the same sort of time. And now we had independent rear suspension, rear transaxle, sequential gearboxes, standardised damn near everything was the name of the game. The rules were devised to allow new manufacturers to enter the sport, and that's ironic because only a couple of years prior, Mitsubishi was begging to enter with their locally made Magna and were told to piss off as it didn't run a V8 and it was a front-wheel drive. So now, of course, supercars, they want all these manufacturers to come in, so they've opened it up. Nissan have immediately announced that they were coming back in, and they were going to be coming in with the Altima. Everybody thought for a while that they might bring the GTR, but it turned out to be the Altima. And strangely, this car didn't have a V8 or rear-wheel drive either in real life, but under the new rules, they were allowed to use a modified petrol engine or something, and they had to run rear-wheel drive and everything else. So it just shows how far away from the prior obsession with keeping true to the road-going product, how far away from that actually moved. And then we had Erebus Motorsport. They would also come in with some privately run Mercedes-Benz AMG E63s, which, from all reports, was much to the annoyance of Mercedes-Benz, who really didn't want anything to do with them. The reason for the turnabout and the attitude from V8 Supercars was because they could see the writing on the wall, and that was that the local car industry was dying. Mitsubishi had closed down their plant, picked up everything, and just gone back to Japan. They stopped making the Magnas and the 380s over here. Holden Ford, the local production, absolutely in its death throes as well. And there was a very real possibility that supercars could wind up having a ton of teams with nothing to race if that happened. And so quite wisely they opened up a competition. So a year after the Nissan and the Mercedes cars joined in the field, they were also joined by Volvo. And it appeared that V8 Supercars gamble had paid off. Even though there was nothing overly Holden or Ford related about any of the cars on track, the racing was good and the fans were happy, mostly. Although some noises were being made about how different the cars had become from the road cars upon which they were based. The Volvo S60, for example, that the Volvo team was running was much bigger, all dimensions, all bigger, to actually fit in with the racing rules than the road going version. So, and then it really started to all come undone. The first Erebus finally got tired of shouldering all the development of the AMG E63 and being ignored by Mercedes-Benz, and they just went and switched to Holden Commodores. Then Volvo pulled the plug at the end of 2016, and GRM, who had been running them, also went back to running Holdens. And finally, Nissan grew weary of a lack of success and pulled out at the end of 2018, and for this coming year, Kelly Racing will continue to run the old Altimas, but they're doing so without any of the factory support, and you get the impression that it's mainly just because they had these cars there and they didn't really have a deal with anyone else. So to make matters worse, both Holden and Ford announced that they'd be ceasing local manufacturing in 2017, and this is as V8 Supercars had predicted. The Falcons would be discontinued altogether, while the ZB Commodore would be made overseas, and it's heavily based on an Opel, with its design roots coming from Peugeot or something like that. There seems to be a fair bit of debate about where it's actually from, depending on what side of that fence you sit on in terms of your brand loyalty, but either way, it's not an Australian-produced Holden, and it doesn't come out with a V8, and it doesn't come with rear-wheel drive either. So I have heard some rumours about a potential sporty edition coming out that does have those things, but remains to be seen. So, in response, Supercars have developed the rules for the Gen 2 of their current package, and that is allowing 4, 6 or 8 cylinder engines. They keep the front engine layout, the rear wheel drive layout, and also allowing two-door coupe models for the first time. Unfortunately, it appeared that no one thought that allowing two-door coupes into the series, they may need to modify the control roll cage design for four-door sedans, because of course the cars are a different shape. This oversight means the first coupe into the series is this heap of shit. Just have a look at that thing. It looks absolutely nothing like a Mustang. It's meant to be a Ford Mustang, and it's Ford's replacement for the discontinued Falcon. They tell us it's a Mustang. What it actually looks like is a Mustang swallowed a Falcon whole. It looks like somebody described a Mustang down the phone to the guys designing the V8 supercar. It looks nothing like a Mustang, and it's the ultimate illustration, as far as I'm concerned. That car is just the ultimate illustration of the mess Supercars has found itself in. They've allowed so many changes to the cars, and of course these things, I'm not sitting here saying that these were, up until this point, that they were stock road cars, because they obviously weren't, but one of the big things that Supercars used to pride itself on is the way that they'd achieved parity between the makes, but the cars still really looked very, very closely faithful to the road-going product. And that has been completely abandoned with this generation car, this Mustang. And the fans aren't fooled. You know, this series has always been more about makes than drivers, and that's one of the things that actually sets it apart from Formula One or NASCAR or really touring cars anywhere else in the world, apart from perhaps Germany, where it's the brand loyalty of the fans rather than the driver. Now, once upon a time, the fact that Supercars had managed to attain parity while keeping the cars from going down the NASCAR route of identical apart from the stickers, as I said, that was a point of pride, but that's completely gone. The cars are cut and shut and stretched and bent to fit around the dimensions of a VY Commodore, and it shows. All the new manufacturers have left, and the two that remain don't exist. I know in the case of Ford that's not technically true, but I mean Ford Australia, upon which the series was really founded. So, sure, international names like 888, Penske, Andretti United have joined the series now, But how long will they hang around if GM do as they're reportedly planning and offload the Holden brand? And if they can't offload it, they can close it down altogether. And if you think they won't, they did it to Pontiac. And Pontiac had a far bigger place, especially within the US, in motoring than did Holden. And they killed Pontiac. So if they killed Pontiac, don't think they wouldn't do the same to Holden if they can't offload it. So all of this means, unless a new manufacturer can be enticed to join, this may leave us with a depleted grid of aesthetic Mustang abortions that, if you squint vaguely, kind of look like what they're trying to tell you that it is. And all in all, due to circumstances mostly beyond their control, it's hard to see many positive signs going forward for supercars. They've lost a massive amount of their road relevance, and for a series that's always been about the manufacturers, that's not good. By being all about the manufacturers, you inevitably put yourself at the mercy of them. But supercars couldn't help that. It's what the fans followed. And funnily enough, if they followed a more open and multi-manufacturer approach at the demise of Group A, they may have avoided all this. But to have predicted that then, when every Australian driveway had a Holden or Ford in it, that by 2017 they would have both disappeared, it would have meant the world's biggest and best crystal ball. You know, they couldn't have possibly predicted that. But I guess for the moment, the fan base is still strong. So it's not all doom and gloom. Fan base is still there. They're still pulling really big crowds, really big TV audience as far as their Fox arrangement goes. As a consequence, the sponsor dollars are still rolling in. And financially, it all seems to be very healthy. There don't seem to be many teams out there sort of struggling to attract sponsors and so on. All the cars look very well supported. But is it sustainable given the current circumstances? And let's not forget that, again, there's an overseas threat on the horizon, as there was with Super Tourers 20 years ago. It's TCR, which is really a new global type of touring car racing. It's been very popular overseas. It much better represents the type of cars that people are actually buying. And if they get one or two notable drivers going into that series, it can really bring a massive threat onto the viability of supercars going forward, in my opinion. So what do you think? Will we look back on the 2000s as the heyday of supercars? Or will some form of saviour arrive? Will everything just naturally progress and take its course? People will get used to these car shapes that we've got. We'll wind up with Camaros in it, maybe from GM, and will people follow those as closely? I mean, what's your opinion of the way that they're going to move forward, and what direction do you think the series will or should take? So that's really all I've got to say on that. So very interested to hear what you guys have got to say about that. So please comment below if you've got an opinion on it. As always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.